Yesterday morning, we got to hear just such a cool testimony. After children's church one week, during offering, I asked the kids to share their pictures, and Zachary didn't want to just share his picture. He wanted to share everything that the picture represented, and just so cool. Our kids are being taught well, not only by our teachers, but by their parents, and it's good. This morning, I want to start by spending a little bit of time talking to you about a guy named John. You may know him. Because for about a year, John's been working in the office across the hall from me. I wish you could have been there the first day that he walked into our building. Because we have some mutual friends, and John was looking to start a business. He'd always been in construction, but he wanted to start his own construction business. And we have these mutual friends who told him that there was a church with some office space available. And church isn't exactly John's thing. And so he walks in, and I can just see how nervous he is. He's looking around like someone's gonna jump around the corner and get him, or like lightning bolts are gonna start falling from heaven. And then I could tell that he was actually just nervous to meet me. A pastor was gonna be his landlord. He didn't really know a pastor. What were these pastor people like? But we meet, and I give him a tour of the space that he was gonna rent, and I start to show him around the rest of the building. And you could actually watch the transformation happening sort of on his body. He just gets less and less tense. And we haven't quite finished the tour yet when I say to him, I say, listen, there's no rush. We're not in a hurry. Just let me know when you've had some time to consider it, if you think the space will work for you. And he immediately says, I love it. It's perfect. Where do I sign? And that was the beginning of John's relationship with our church. And for the last year, John has been here, often more than any single one of us. But do you know what he's seen this year? Sean, every Monday morning, coming in to talk with me, set time about faith, about the Bible, about John Wesley, about our ministries. Sometimes, if you can imagine Sean and me in the same room, we get excited and loud, and so John had to close his door. John would also see Ken and Melody every Monday, most Mondays, a lot of Mondays, here serving food with Home at Sunset. John would see Dan, Dag, often responding to facilities issues, getting a call, coming down to check it out, and then a few hours later, either Dan or a member of the facilities team down here giving their time away as an offering to God and to our church. But it wasn't just members of facility teams. All sorts of people make their way down here throughout the week to do this or that with various ministries, and he saw a lot of it. John would see Laura living out her faith on a daily basis through her work, offering people healing, emotional and relational, as a counselor. By the time John was getting here in the mornings on Wednesdays, he would see people already leaving the building, having already met together for prayer. And he'd see all sorts of men and women wandering through our doors, looking for help. Sometimes our guests, not finding Carla or me, would wander into John's office and ask him if he was the pastor. A few times, I got out of the bathroom or came back from Starbucks to find John cornered by someone and with panic in his eyes, looking for someone, anyone, to rescue him and save this person. John also saw the relationship that I have with Carla. He saw the way that we work together, the care that we have for each other, that has clearly been built over many years, our laughter, as you can imagine. And he noticed the way that we, me and Carla and David and all of the people wandering through the building at any point treated his employees, knowing their names, knowing stuff about them, caring about them. John mentioned all of these things to me at one point or another throughout this last year. It all stood out to him as interesting. And then you may already know part of this, but 2 weeks ago, John told me that his company was going to close down. And he doesn't hide how he feels well, and so you could tell that he felt defeated and embarrassed a little bit, and you could see the stress that he was carrying. And so we just sat in my office and talked for a little while, and then he asked the question, because I was his landlord, and there's business to do. What were we going to do about his contract? Because technically we were locked into a contract that would cost him about $30,000 for the next year. And I told him the board and I had a meeting on Monday night, and we would talk about it and figure something out. And so the board and I met, and I want to brag to you about our board here for just a minute. I know James tells us not to boast, but James also tells us to be on the lookout for the wisdom from above. And I saw it in our board that night. I shared with them what John was facing, and their immediate response was, of course we're going to offer John mercy and free him from his contract. Like it wasn't even a given. And one board member even said, listen, even if the loss of a renter for us was going to put us in a really tight financial place, it would still obviously be the Christ-like thing to do. As we discussed it a little more, we decided that since the one thing that we'll actually still have to pay after he leaves is the property taxes, we sort of asked, what if we asked John to pick up whatever part of the property taxes isn't covered by his deposit? And so it came out to $1,200. And so we agreed, and I go to John, and I let him know that the board wants to free him from his lease. And I got to watch John experience in real time, and maybe you've seen this in somebody before, where they just experience God's kindness. I mean, Jesus tells us to forgive debts. And by the world's standards, John owed us. He knew it. He knew that we had a deal worth $30,000. And we have a property manager who was ready, if we wanted, to hold John to the contract, because that's her job. We ask her to do that, to guide us in that way. But when I told him in that moment, your debt is forgiven, you could see Jesus removing the heavy burden that John was carrying. I mean, you could see the weariness just lifting, and it happened in front of my eyes. It was so cool. And as we talked more, I asked him if, in the closeout of the business, if he could cover the remaining $1,200 for the property taxes. And he and his bookkeeper together were both there, and they looked at each other and just kind of sighed. And you could see the despair return for a minute, because he's in deep. And $1,200, as small as that might seem in comparison to $30,000, was going to put him in that much deeper. And so we agreed we'd talk more later. And I'm coming to the end of John's story here, but we had talked on Tuesday of this week. And between then and when John and I talked again on Thursday, someone had reached out to me. They wanted to confirm how much John would need to pay for property taxes. $1,200. And then the question came, can I cover it? I don't know. Let me think about that for a little bit. Of course you can cover it. 2 hours later, I was talking to John again, and he was stressed, and he kind of ran into my office because he had some ideas about how maybe to cover the property taxes without paying cash. And he started in on his first idea, and I just got to stop him. And I said, John, someone from our church asked me if they could pay the remainder of your property taxes for you. And I'm not kidding, in that moment, his eyes started to pour, and he stumbled over his words. And he just, are you serious right now? Are you serious right now? Are you serious right now? Yes. Absolutely. And we spent a while longer together, and he just told me, again, I've heard it before, about how good his time with us has been and how meaningful it had all been for him. And he kept crying. And he couldn't believe the goodness that he was experiencing, and he hugged me, like really hugged me. And it's because John had his debts canceled. And then he was given generous grace above and beyond that. And he was deeply moved. Deeply. He experienced Jesus in a profound and real way this week. And not through any one of us, but he experienced the body of Christ all year long. He experienced the members of Christ's body working together as one, moving in response to the Holy Spirit, showing John what God is like. And what is our God like? Well, for one, our God is gentle. Do you believe that about God? That the God who created the heavens and the earth, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh, the God who met Moses at the burning bush and who brought Israel out of Egypt, the God who made a dwelling in the midst of Israel. Do you believe that this God is the same God who is revealed to us in Jesus, and that this God is gentle? I find that people have very different answers to this question. There are some who just don't believe that God is gentle. They read some of the First Testament, largely out of context stories where God doesn't sound very gentle, and they decide God is not gentle. And for some who decide that God is not gentle, this is terrifying. If God isn't gentle, God must just be sort of sitting around waiting for me to mess up so he can smite me. For others, they love the idea that God is not gentle. You can find churches that sort of brand themselves as the tough guy, man's man kind of church. They want you to know that Jesus was no sissy, and they highlight all of God's most fierce or aggressive actions, and they tell us to go and do likewise. But then there are those who do believe that God is gentle. But how often do those who believe that God is gentle actually believe that that his gentleness is either passive or timid or weak? And truthfully, there are some who like the idea that God is passive or timid or weak. It probably means he's not really that busy sort of paying attention to us. But there are others who are terrified by it. Because if God is passive or timid or weak, what does that mean about evil in the world? And so a couple questions for us. These are going to frame kind of the rest of our time considering gentleness. Can we make sense of what the Bible means when it uses the word gentle? What do the biblical authors mean when they talk about gentleness? And then what do we mean when we say that our God is a gentle God? By the time we're done, I hope that we can look back on our story of John and see the gentleness of God on display through our church all year. And so let's take a few minutes to survey some of the passages where biblical authors talk about living gently. Really, we're dealing with Paul and Peter. In the Gospels, Jesus is the one who's described as gentle. But Paul and Peter are the ones who sort of give us some meat, put some flesh on these bones. Both Paul and Peter wrote letters to early followers of Jesus, instructing them to live gently. Paul starts out, he writes 2 letters to the church in Corinth, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And this was a church, if you know anything about it, that was a troubled church for him. And he was writing them on a regular basis. There are actually more letters than what we have because they mention these other letters in these letters. And he was attempting to confront some of the real issues that they were facing, some of the real sin that they were engaged in, some of the ways in which they were falling short of the gospel. And they weren't super fond of Paul. I mean, you probably know that experience. Somebody, as gently as they might do it, correcting you can be hard. And so they had actually already resisted some of Paul's efforts to correct them. And so he asks them this question, and I'm going to run through some of these, but if you're taking notes, I'll just give you the reference sort of quickly, and you can go back and look at it. But 1 Corinthians 4:21 is where Paul asks them this question, like, what do you want? Kind of, what do you want from me? Shall I come to you with a rod, or with love and a spirit of gentleness? See, in the context, Paul clearly intends there to be a correct answer. Of course, they want or should want Paul to come in gentleness. But this comment is helpful for us because it contrasts gentleness with the physical discipline that would come with a rod, which reminds us that each of the times where gentleness is described, that this sort of physical violence, this physical discipline is being contrasted. Paul will later write another letter to this same church, a follow-up, and he confirms that he does indeed come to them in gentleness, but not simply his own. And this is one of this is a beautiful passage, 2 Corinthians 10:1, because Paul is taking the story of the Gospels and he is drawing them into the life of the church and saying that who Jesus is, this is who we are called to be, and this is who I am attempting to be on your behalf. And he says that I come to you in the gentleness of Jesus. Paul then fills out some of this out in his other letters, and he writes to Timothy and Titus. And Timothy and Titus are younger men that he's invested in, and he's sent them to go lead local churches. And in these letters, Paul is describing the kind of character that either Timothy or Titus should have, that the leaders of the church should have, that individual followers of Jesus should have, and that they should be on the lookout for these things. And Paul says things like, so in 1 Timothy, he's writing to Timothy, 1 Timothy 3:3, he says, overseers of the church must not be violent, but gentle. In case we think that gentleness is only required for leaders, Paul then tells Titus that he should remind everyone in the church to avoid quarreling. Such a great word. As I was working through this week's sermon, quarreling showed up multiple times. I was like, that's an underused word. We should use it more often. We should avoid quarreling, but we should use the word quarreling. And to be gentle. Titus is linking these, quarreling with being gentle. They're opposites in the way he's using them. Paul then tells Timothy that anyone who serves the Lord, anyone serve the Lord out there, must correct their opponents with gentleness. Anyone wonder if Paul had Facebook in mind? Ooh, social media. Paul then wrote a letter to the Galatians. Paul tells that church, restore a brother or sister in a spirit of gentleness. It's sort of a decent overview of what Paul does with gentleness. But then let's take a quick peek at what Peter does. Peter is writing to a church about the relationship between servants and masters. And Peter contrasts two different kinds of masters. He says there is the good and gentle master, and there is the unjust master. In light of everything that we've heard from Paul, you can probably get a sense for how Peter is using gentle, right? The good and gentle master is a fair master, makes appropriate provisions to sustain the life of the servant, doesn't hurt the servant, isn't aggressive to the servant, isn't easily angered by the servant's actions. These would be some of the things that just or unjust might draw out. But Peter goes on to instruct Christians to always be prepared with an answer. You've heard this passage before, right? 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared with an answer for anyone who asks you the reason for the hope that is in you. Are you ready? Do you have the answer? Yesterday, as part of our summit time, it was awesome. As we broke off into groups, the very first thing we did in the morning was just share our stories of faith. Remind each other about God's grace in our lives. Remind ourselves of what God has done to save us. It was awesome. Be prepared with an answer for anyone who asks you for the reason that you have hope. But Peter qualifies that. Answer with gentleness and respect. For Peter, gentleness should shape two sort of spheres of our lives. It should characterize our use of authority. So whatever authority you might have, if you are a boss, if you are a parent, if you are a landlord, if you are a teacher, you can be good and gentle, or you can be unjust. Peter also thinks that gentleness should describe the way that we talk about our faith. You can tell people about Jesus in a way that is gentle and that is respectful. Or you can tell people about Jesus in ways that are coercive, manipulative, forceful, rude. One of the things that you might notice looking at both Paul and Peter is that they both seem to describe gentleness by what it's not. Sometimes for a new concept, and this does seem to be a new concept sort of for the church, like a value that didn't exist in the cultures, the Roman culture, Roman and Greek cultures that the church was taking root in. And so you sometimes have to describe it. What's this gentleness thing? Well, it's not this, and it's not that, and it's not that, and it's not that. Okay, now we can start to talk about what it is. But gentleness is not aggressive. It's not adversarial or antagonistic. Gentleness is not violent. Gentleness is not easily angered. And yet we also have to recognize that gentleness is also not passive, nor is it weak, nor is it timid. We're in the book of James, and James tells us that the wisdom that comes from God is gentle. I titled this morning's sermon, Acting Gently, on purpose. Because for James, wisdom is something that is done. Wisdom is lived. Gentle is actually something we do. Gentle is something that God does. Gentle is who God is. And gentle is what God is making us. The First Testament tells the story of a gentle God. I don't know if you believe that. The New Testament tells us, shows us what it would look like if a gentle God had skin on and walked around among us. Think of Jesus, rejected by the people in his hometown. Does he then quarrel with them? Does he defend himself when they tried to kill him? No, Jesus just tells them straightforwardly, gently, that their lack of faith kept him from doing amazing things in their midst. Their lack of faith kept them from life. But then he moves on. When Jesus is falsely accused, He doesn't argue back. And Jesus never seems to force himself on anyone. He never manipulates. He never seems to seek out an argument. Now, there are moments where others react to things he says. But where is Jesus reacting? Even in the moment that usually will get drawn out into this conversation where Jesus comes into the temple ready to cleanse it. He is acting on the Father's behalf to judge the temple. There's no reaction there. It's a deliberate act to declare the truth. The temple has become a mockery of everything it was meant to be. And so he confronts those in the temple, but also in this moment, he is doing something that you might say is not gentle. But he's also attempting in this moment to provoke what will come. Jesus, every time we find him in every story, doesn't draw back from people. He engages boldly and with strength that is under control. He's confident. He speaks the truth, and he also has this amazing ability to disarm hostile confrontations. The challenge for us is not usually to believe that Jesus is gentle. Like, we can usually go there pretty well. But the challenge for us is to see Jesus and believe that this is really what God is like. I'm convinced that we have been told too many times that we are sinners in the hands of an angry God. It doesn't matter that the First Testament repeats over and over that God is slow to anger, and that the stories actually show us God's slowness to anger, that he is eager and quick to forgive, and that he is so patient and he is abundantly kind to sinners. Like, it doesn't matter for how many times God gave Israel another chance and another chance and another chance. We have this tendency, for a variety of reasons, to zero in on anything that looks like punishment, and we start to fear the God that we find in these stories because we don't see ourselves as sinners in the hands of a loving God. Do you know what the Bible doesn't say? It doesn't say turn to God or else God will punish you and make you pay for your rebellion. It's kind of a provocative statement. What does God do with sin and sinners? We see it. In the First Testament, we're told that God offers forgiveness for sinners from the very first pages. And God tells again and again sinful people to draw near to him. God's not on the hunt to punish sinners. He tells them how to bring a sin offering, to confess their sin, and how to walk as people who've been forgiven. But just in case we didn't get the message, God goes even further. What does God do with sinners? God gives up his son for sinners because we are sinners in the hands of a loving God. He dies for us, for sinners. God is not looking to punish our sin. He has already taken care of sin. Do you know what the Bible is warning us about? It's not turn or burn because God's mad. It's not come to God or else. We hear God calling us to turn. We hear God calling us to turn to him, not to avoid punishment that he will inflict on us, but because God is the only source of life in all creation that can sustain us for eternity. That's the truth. God is the only source of life in all creation that can sustain us for all eternity. Nothing can live apart from God. Consider this. Imagine oxygen can talk to you. Oxygen doesn't punish you for refusing to breathe it. But if you refuse to breathe, to inhale oxygen, you will die. A lack of oxygen will kill you. But there is a consequence for rejecting the source of life. But God is not going to force you to breathe. God is so gentle when he approaches us in our sin. God is gentle when he invites us to know him and trust him deeply. God is gentle when we begin to follow and we stumble almost right away. And then we get up and we stumble again and we keep stumbling because that's what children do. And he's so gentle with us. It's not an accident that Jesus talked about God as his Father. In the very best sense, God is gentle again and again. If you spend much time reading about the early church, the church after the days of the New Testament, one of the constant themes found in the writings of outsiders, people who are outside of the church, people who are not followers of Jesus, who just saw Christians, was that they thought that Christians were weird. They talked about this strange group of people who profess only one God. Christians were called atheists because they only worshiped one God. And they worship a crucified and risen king. One of the things that shows up in these writings, one of the weirdest things about these Christians, these followers of Jesus, was how gentle they were in their business practices. Again and again, this shows up in writings. That Christians weren't looking to gouge people in the marketplace. That they actually refused over and over again to take advantage of others. Christians were known for forgiving debts, big debts. The Christians would do business with anyone. And they refused to make pagan shop owners or traders conform to their way of life. In the ancient world, just to give you a quick peek, there were like hierarchies of like where people were valuable. And so like if you were super honorable in the world, like you wouldn't even interact with certain kinds of business people. But in the church, those categories disappeared and you would do business with everyone. The Christians had a reputation for being great trading partners. And as weird as the Christians were, people walked away from transactions wondering what in the world had just happened to them. There is no one in the world like this. Who does this? Who are these people? Over the last year, this is the experience that we as a church have given to our friend named John. Praise God for the visible witness that John has experienced in our life together. I have a couple questions for us because, as you know, our time in James is meant to move us into action. And so these are the questions, and we'll break up into groups to spend some time discussing these. But let me ask you this. Where else have you seen the gentleness of God among our church family members? So where else have you seen the gentleness of God lived out among us? And we don't have, in these little groups, these are sort of supposed to give you a little taste of conversation, of taking these conversations into lunch and the rest of the day. Keep these short because it's really important to me that you guys actually get to spend some time praying together. So the first is, where have you seen the gentleness of God among us? And then I wonder, if you would be so bold. James tells us to confess our sins to one another and we will be healed. Would you be willing to share with your group an area, a place where you have the sense that you lack gentleness? There's a few places that you might consider. Do you find yourself super reactive in life? That reactivity is not gentleness. Is it in the way that you talk with others on Facebook or social media or somewhere else? Do you find yourself often starting, even if not on purpose, disagreements or quarrels? I snuck that word in there again. Are you aggressive in the ways that you hold people to certain standards? Remember, Paul said in Galatians to restore a brother or sister gently. But do you like to come at someone? You're living in sin or something. Aggressive. Do you pressure people with guilt to do things? Are you forceful in the way that you push your faith on others? There's a lot in that list. And so if you would be so bold to share with your group one of those areas where you find yourself lacking gentleness. Where have you seen God's gentleness among us? Where are you lacking gentleness? And then would you just pray for each other? Again, James tells us, if you lack wisdom, pray. If we lack the wisdom from above that is gentle, let's pray. And so would you pray for each other specifically for this wisdom?